once I get going, I'm okay, but it's
yeah, it'll be fun.
Yeah.
Well, welcome everybody. Glad you're all here. We will go ahead and get started as people will continue to join. If you're having trouble with connectivity, if you just hop off your video, that'll sometimes help you and it'll strengthen your audio, and at least you'll be able to hear that way. This is the Dallas Free Lecture Series. I know most of you know that. We do this in unison with the Unity Church on Forest Lane. And it's been many months since we have held a lecture at the church. And we were just talking today, we don't know when we'll be returning, but are so grateful that you all keep showing up, because this is just a service we like to offer. And we were a little afraid that this would not work, but everyone's really adjusted with COVID. So I'm glad that we all get to meet continuously throughout this. Tonight we have a very special speaker, Elyse Kitterman. She is one of our group, D2 counseling group. So I'm very excited to have her speaking today on one of her topics that she's very passionate about. So I'll let you introduce your topic, Elyse, but I know this is dear to your heart.
Well, we're going to be, okay, it's very dear to my heart. We're going to be, let Steve and I introduce ourselves first. So my name's Elyse Kitterman, and I work at D2 in private practice presently. My history is that I'm retired from American Airlines. I worked with them in their employee assistance program and ran the Northwest Division and the Southwest Division for almost 25 years. And it was a great job, and I learned a lot, and it was really fun. And through that job, I really got attached to and very deeply involved with grief and loss. And it's become a passion of mine. I'll talk more about it, but basically what I found with grief is that if we can walk through, I call it a healing process, the grief process, healing really. And if we can walk through it, as painful as it can be, I believe it can be a transformation for us in how we relate to the universe. And that could be spiritually, that could be God of your understanding. But I absolutely think it's an incredible, beautiful process. So it's near and dear to me, and I hope I can pass that on to you tonight. Steve?
I'm Steve Kelly. I'm the founder and owner of Quest Counseling Center. I'm in private practice in Allen, Texas, and the vast majority of the work that I do in my private practice deals with addiction. I also do a lot of work within the LGBTQ community, addressing various relational and addiction issues found within that demographic. I offer some men's groups and recovery groups, and been in this field for not quite as long as Elyse and Daniel and Dina, but I love the work. So I've been in the addiction field for probably about 10 to 15 years. Prior to that, I was in representative ministry for 23 years. I served as a United Methodist minister in the Louisiana Annual Conference. And I also, so I served a wide variety of churches, big and small, rural, inner city. I also was a chaplain at Angola State Penitentiary, which is just outside of Baton Rouge. At the time that I was there, Angola was the largest maximum security prison in the nation, and also served a stint as a death row chaplain at the penitentiary. But been in private practice, and really and truly, that's kind of where Elyse and I met. When I moved to Texas, we both got jobs working at a residential treatment facility. She was one of the primary care counselors, and I was one of the director of spiritual care for the facility. And so my experience, as far as our topic tonight, is also very much near and dear to me. I spend a lot of time in hospitals. I spend a lot of time in people's homes, walking through the process of grieving and mourning, and really came to understand, at least for me, that grieving is very much a part of what it means to be a human being. Grieving is one of the things that really defines us. Physiologically, we're geared for grieving. And one of the core affects that is in that limbic system, those core affects that we're all hardwired into our brain, is sadness and grief. So it's interesting, I think, sometimes when we tend to see that grieving process as something that we should simply get through, but it's a part of what defines us. It makes us human. It also provides us connection. As you and I grieve people that we love, they draw us together with others who have had losses as well. So I'm very much a proponent of really embracing the grieving process and how important it is for our general well-being and just about what it means to be human. So what I would share with you is that when Elyse and I got together and we started talking about this, we talked about that one of the things that we wanted to be sure that people really understood is that understanding some of the theoretical work that's done around grieving. So one of the things that we want to accomplish tonight is to make sure that those of you that are participating understand the 4 tasks of mourning, and those are important. And also the 5 stages of grief. And there's a lot of information about that, but also some of it's changed. And so we're going to be talking about that because I think there's some misconceptions, especially around the 5 stages of grief and how that process works. So we really want to clarify and educate people on that. We also want to really help people understand this whole idea of complicated grief. Complicated grief has really come to the forefront given everything that's been going on in the world around COVID, but yet complicated grief has been around for a while, this concept, this idea. So we really want to talk about that process as well. We also want to talk about the implications of COVID and how it affects the grieving process. That the impact of society and culture and individuals and families as a result of COVID-19 has really altered the way, or at least challenged the way in which we grieve. And so we're going to be talking about that as well. So we really want to, and then afterwards we want to hear from you, what questions that you might have. The other part of that too is that the way that Elyse and I talked about doing this is that as we go through this, we're going to be sharing some of our own personal experience as far as with grief. And there's some things through Elyse's work that she brings to the table that is a very unique perspective about the grieving process. And then I'm going to be talking about some of the personal grief that I've experienced as well. So we want to try and put meat on the bones, so to speak, to help people understand how this walks and how we experienced this material. So that's kind of where we're going to go. And Elyse is going to take a minute and she's going to talk about the types of grief.
So I got nervous and I didn't tell anything else about myself except American Airlines. So after American, I wanted to do more clinical work and I went into treatment. I started treatment, doing my work originally before American Airlines in addiction a long time ago. And so I wanted to do more clinical, and I returned and worked in a treatment center for 9.5, 10 years. Thank gosh, I'm in private practice now. It was quite a long experience, but I loved it and learned so much, and hopefully helped a lot of people. They certainly taught me a lot. And with it, so my scope of practice is around grief and trauma and all addictions, inclusive of sex addiction. So, and I do a lot of work with women of partners. That's about that. So, okay, so talking a little bit about, just starting very basic, like what is grief? And so it's a natural and normal response to the loss of someone we love or something that's extremely meaningful to us. In the process of grief, it's summarized as sadness. It felt a lot of sadness felt after the loss of someone or something special to you. But that suffering and that pain can be very deep and become very complex. And with that, we respond with our behavioral, emotional thoughts and emotions, and physiological changes happen within us. If the loss, so the closer a loss is to you, the more intense and the length of time it's going to take you to heal. But because we're human, we have some wonderful adaptation to handle loss. We can, because of the way we attach, we also have attachment to loss, and we can get used to things over time. It forms and develops and changes as we adapt to the loss. So the grieving gets less, and we start to heal. So grieving it's natural, it's normal. Some people don't really understand it. They don't know, they don't think they're doing it right. They don't know how and what to do. And what I find is that we just have to allow people to experience what their experience is going to be. Everybody goes through the same emotional responses. However, everybody does it in their own way, in their own time. And there's no right or wrong way to grieve. I like to compare it to a physical injury. Say that you had a car accident, you broke your leg, you went to the hospital, and the care was, being in traction. You had nurses taking care of you, and family came to visit, and it was really excruciatingly painful at first. Over time, it got better. Then you started rehabilitation, and eventually you got used to it, but it takes a long time. And it's the same thing with grieving. We feel that loss inside of us. It's not so much outside, as if I have a broken leg with 3 spots out of whack. So we want to learn. So it takes time. It's it's just individual in nature. I think that's so important because people want to know, am I doing it right? Am I experiencing it the right way? And everybody's different. Grief comes in waves. It's really cyclical in nature. One of the, I love the 5 stages of grief, but what I've learned over time, and most of us have learned, is that they are not stages. We go through them and go back and forth in them, and we circle around in them. So they're really cyclical. And I think the best is that we need to be kind, gentle, allow others to help us, ask for help, let people just love us, and just allow yourself to have some tender care. And I think people rush it. And I don't know how many of you are therapists, but in my practice, I tend to really try to normalize that for people, that they just have to go through it. And there's no quick answer, or there's no quick fix. Many of us, of course, use addictions. We try to do everything we can to avoid the pain, the emotional pain. We maybe work too much, drink too much, eat too much, lay in bed too much. And that doesn't help at all. It just prolongs the loss. So that's what grief is. And then there's a couple of different types of grief that I'm going to talk about. And one of them is acute grief. And acute grief is what occurs really early on in the loss. And it dominates the life of the bereaved person, both physically, physiologically, psychologically, spiritually. There's really strong feelings of yearning, longing, sorrow. There's very insistent thoughts. We think about the person all the time. It's just so painful physically. I remember learning someone had died, and I just remember bending over and clutching my stomach. I mean, it's just really important to allow ourselves to have those sensory feelings. And people in the acute grief stage usually heal on their own. It just takes a matter of time. Like I said, I mean, what I found is if an event is really close to you, such as a husband, a house fire, even a pet, it could take a year, 2 years, 2 to 5 years sometimes, depending upon how deep that relationship was. So then there's complicated grief, which is also has been referred to as complex grief. And what happens is acute grief doesn't go away. It just doesn't stop, and it moves into the complicated grief. It's persistent, it continues, it's a form of intense grief where the normal feelings we have, as I stated with the acute grief, of yearning and longing and sadness and pain, become predominantly a major part of our life. That's all that we deal with. That's all we feel. So we have preoccupation of thought, memories of the person or what you've lost, and the grief just continues to dominate your life. The future feels bleak and empty. There's not much hope. And the painful emotions are so long lasting that one has trouble recovering from the loss and resuming life. So I was reading an article a while back from the Mayo Clinic, and it describes the feeling the best way I know for complicated grief. And many of you will probably relate either through seeing a client that you've gone through or yourself have experienced it. But it says, pain comes on as a tornado, getting worse, never leaves, making it harder to breathe and live. Comfort won't come and despair doesn't go away. I just love that. So it exemplifies it so much. So I'm going to share a little bit of examples of complications from grief. I want to note that these are normal. We're going to talk about maladaptive and dysfunctional behavior. However, they're normal for grief until they are not normal, where they're dominating a life. So I want to be really clear on that. And many who are present tonight, the same thing with the quote, you will either have experienced this yourselves and or clients. So maladaptive thoughts, they're really the same as in the acute, but most of the thoughts during complicated grief is that person is only focused on the grief. There's a lot of catastrophizing. They worry regarding if they're grieving in the right way or the wrong way. They dread the future in a world without their loved ones. It's really common to hear them say, I can't go on, I can't live without them. They ruminate continuously over these kind of thoughts. So it's just constant, exhausting, can't redirect them. It's so sad to watch. And you just want to hold them and let them know it'll be all right. So, and then the dysfunctional behaviors are seen as avoiding reminders of the loss or escaping from painful realities. You try to connect with the deceased through sensory sensations such as smelling clothes or listening to music, recalling times together, and living in those times. So avoiding people, places, activities. You might listen to music and get lost in the music and the memories of it. I just want to really be clear with complicated grief that people are in this constantly. That's all they do. And they can't stop it. The other thing, sorry, with complicated grief is inadequate emotional regulation. So as I stated before, grief comes in waves, and most of us have a range of coping skills to negotiate these emotions, but people in this stage of grief, or this type of grief, I should say, have a really difficult time managing and focusing on anything. And what they focus goes to, what they do is activate themselves rather than go and do healthy routines or listen to people or take some time to rest or take some time to do something where you can relax your mind, read a book. Sometimes you can't, but they look for things to activate them more. And I'm not saying they're doing it on purpose, for sure. It's something that just makes them feel safe and comfortable. So what we want to know is, with complicated grief, the way to start helping someone is developing a routine, providing adequate sleep and nourishment, exercise. Social contact is one of the most important things in healing, because we adapt well to we're attachment people, because we are attached and we can attach to a loss eventually. We need the support of family. We need the support of friends, coworkers, bringing back structure and routine into our life. So then there's ambiguous loss. Now, I was not really familiar with ambiguous loss until maybe a year ago, and Steve turned me on to it. And I sometimes get so bothered because over the years, there's so much terminology, cognitive behavioral, then there's another type of therapy, which is cognitive behavioral, but it uses all different terminology. So I was like, oh, what's ambiguous loss? What is it really stemming from? Is it complicated grief? Is it acute grief? Anyway, it's really interesting. It's a loss that occurs without closure or understanding. So it leaves people in search of an answer, and then it complicates and delays the process of grieving, often resulting in unresolved grief, frozen feelings, and living in limbo. Some examples of ambiguous loss are infertility, miscarriages, having a loved one who has Alzheimer's, dementia, is in a coma, death of an ex-spouse, family member, you lose a part of your body. So you don't really know. There's two forms with ambiguous loss. There's physical, and then there's psychological. And you don't really know which or what you're grieving over. And some examples of that would be, am I still the child of my mother who can't remember me anymore? So, how do you deal with that? And then the other one was, am I still married to my missing spouse? Who's, I don't know where they are, when they're coming back, where they disappeared to. So it's just ambiguity, and you can't find any reason or how to find closure or really get any closure. So I found it interesting because I love trauma. And the overall goal of doing therapy for people who have ambiguous loss is really getting down to the trauma so that the person can reconcile with the loss. So I found that really interesting. So that's what I'm going to say about all the different types of grief. I won't ask questions now. I'm going to turn to Steve, who's going to talk about the 4 tasks of mourning and his journey with them. You have to unmute, yeah.
I'm on. So anybody have any questions for Elyse? Well, we'll provide some time at the end as well. So I want to talk about William Worden's 4 tasks of mourning. So let me set a stage for you as I kind of talk about this. I was married to Janie for 30 years. And in 2008, we divorced. And she was serving as a pastor in Louisiana, and I moved to Texas to with a new job at this residential treatment facility. A year and a half later, I got a phone call from her. It was January, and I remember I was driving, heading back to my house, and she said, "Would you have a second?" And I said, "Well, yeah, absolutely." So we began to talk, and she said, "I just want you to know that I'm leaving the doctor's office, and I've been diagnosed with myeloid leukemia. And they want me to enter into the leukemia center at LSU Medical Center to become a possible candidate for bone marrow transplant and to start treating the leukemia." And I can remember that because I just couldn't make sense of that. She had told me a few weeks ago, a couple of months ago, that she had been struggling with fatigue and just being tired. But you know, knowing Janie, she was very much a hard worker and was one of those pastors that spent those late nights in the church and was always available to people. And you know, so when she shared with me this diagnosis, it would really, I couldn't believe that. It wasn't real for me. And she asked me if I would be willing to drive over to Shreveport to help her get admitted into the hospital there at LSU Medical Center. I said, "Well, absolutely." So packed a bag and went over there. And you know, I remember going into, when they took Janie into her room there at the hospital, and I remember the doctor coming in and him saying there was, our daughter Megan was there, and some of Janie's friends were there, and he said, you know, "Who's the person who's going to be responsible medically for Janie?" And Janie looked at me, and I'll always remember her words, and she said, "Are you up for this?" And I said, "Yeah, I'm all in." And so the doctor said, "Everybody else needs to leave the room." And so they all left the room. And at that point, the doctor spelled out what the plan was and talked about what her chances were. And at that particular point, given the type of leukemia that she had, he gave her a 40% success rate. And so I sat there and I signed papers about power of attorney, medical responsibility, all those kinds of things, still in denial, still thinking that, okay, well, we're going to make it through this. This is going to be just fine. So anyway, to make a long story even longer, so she went through all of the treatment for the leukemia, had the chemotherapy, and got to a point to where she was able to, she went into remission, and so they were able to send her home. And so I was traveling back and forth from Texas to Louisiana with my daughter to care for her. And I was over in Dallas and I got a call, and she said that she had just come from the doctor and that she had fallen out of remission and that they wanted to move forward with a bone marrow transplant, and she had to decide where she wanted to do that. Well, she ended up being admitted to the T. Boone Pickens Cancer Center here in Dallas. And so she was entered into the center, and they immediately began a search for someone who might have a bone marrow match for her. In April of 2011, yeah, 2011, they found a match. It was a young woman. She was 21 years old, and she lived up in the East Coast. So before they can give you a bone marrow transplant, they have to eradicate your immune system. So she had to take several radiation treatments till there was no immune system at all. The funny thing about that is that when they give you the bone marrow from the donor, your blood type changes. And so the ward that we were on, they kind of celebrated, it's your birthday. And the funny thing about it was the bone marrow transplant that they did and completed was on May 8th, which was my birthday. And so Janie and I kind of began to joke about that we had the same birthday. So at all this time, I'm thinking that, it's never dawning on me that we're not going to be successful. And she did very well. The bone marrow transplant went excellent. The doctors came back. They were tickled pink with her blood work. Everything was perfect. We had moved into an apartment not far from the hospital so that they could check on her. And 2 days after we moved into the little apartment, she started running a fever. They admitted her back into the hospital, and they determined that she had an infection and couldn't find where the infection was. They ran all kinds of tests. We were beginning to have conversations with the CDC about possible treatment modalities to find the infection. They finally found it, and it was toxoplasmosis, which is a parasitic infection that one gets sometimes from cats and pork and all kinds of things. So one of the things that happened over time was they could not knock out the infection, and slowly but surely, over time, her brain started seizing, and she started forming lesions in her brain. So one of the things that they had to do for Janie was they had to put her in a medically induced coma in order so they could stop the brain seizures. So over this entire period of time, she's in and out of being lucid. And it suddenly began to dawn on me that this might not turn out well. And then the neurologist came in one day and said that Janie's brain was 98% covered with the lesions and that there was no way that she was going to survive. That there were basically two options, that one, she would wake up and she would know absolutely no one, would never know anyone, and would never be able to care for herself again. The other option is that she would never wake up. They would remove the medications they were giving her that were keeping her in the medically induced coma, and she simply wouldn't wake up. And so we were left the decision about what to do. Now, luckily, Janie and I had had some conversations about what she wanted when this happened. And so the day came when we withdrew life support and Janie passed away. So what I want to share with you is that when Worden is talking about the stages or the tasks of mourning, the first task that we have to accept is accept the reality of the loss. Now, I remember when I was studying this, and I realized that, the reality is that that's not such an easy thing. I sat there and held her hand, and I watched her slip away. I watched her go. I watched her die. But it wasn't real. So one of the first things that I had to overcome was simply acknowledging the fact that she was no longer here. And that was something that took time. Now, Worden also says that once you've done that, once you've accepted the reality of the loss, the next task that's important to accomplish is to allow yourself to experience the pain of the grief. I would consider my loss with Janie to be in some ways an ambiguous loss because we weren't married anymore. But yet we walked through all that together. It's funny how, as a therapist and as a pastor, I've been with people through a lot of grief, and I've watched a lot of people die. And I'm not trying to boast here, but because of my experience in those two areas, I kind of figure I'm kind of an expert in the area. And what I want to tell you is what I found out, that meant nothing. It meant absolutely nothing. I have training in grief and loss from seminary. I have training in grief and loss from master's work in counseling. And I want to tell you, it meant absolutely nothing. There would be days when I would, I remember distinctly going to work, and I remember getting into my truck and driving down the road and crossing over this bridge and looking out over the lake and how beautiful it was and feeling so good. And 5 seconds later, I pulled off on the side of the road and I'm sobbing unconditionally, just uncontrollably. And that, when Elyse talks about that this kind of stuff comes in waves, that's what this is. And so one of the things, the more that I tried to block it, the worse it got. I remember talking to a therapist friend of mine, and one of the smart things that I did was when I was going through this, I got into counseling. And I remember telling the therapist one day, I've never experienced pain like this before. I lost both of my parents when I was in my late 20s, and I don't remember feeling the kind of pain that I'm feeling now. And to this day, I'll always remember his words, and this is what he said, but isn't it worth it?
I love that.
Isn't it worth it? So it takes time as you are able to experience and allow yourself to experience the pain. That's part of what it means to be human. That's part of what it means to grieve. And what I know is if I didn't walk through it then, I would walk through it later. And the walk later would have been so much more difficult. So accepting the reality of the loss, allowing yourself to experience the pain of the grief. And Worden goes on to say that the next step is to adjust to an environment with the deceased missing. So now what I have to do is that I have to adjust to an environment, even though I was estranged from the person that I spent 30 some odd years with, raising a child with, working together and being co-pastors and friends and companions. And one of the things that I found was that one of the blessings that I had was that when Janie and I ended up ending our marriage, we were able to do so, and we parted and still had a good relationship. So one has to adjust to that environment. We've got to be used to not having that person in our life anymore. And the way that works is that, think about the times I remember early on when my parents died. There were just times when I thought about picking up the phone and calling my dad. Or I thought about something really funny that I thought Janie would think would be funny. And I would remember, oh yeah, she's not here anymore. So there's this environment. And then learning how to do things for myself. Learning how to trust my own thoughts and trust my own thinking. That was really important. That's a part of that adjusting, adjusting to holidays, even though that we were estranged, we were celebrating holidays together. And, I had to learn that that's the environment that I had to adjust to. So that was really difficult. And then finally, Wooden says that once we've been able to accept the reality, once we've been able to allow ourselves to experience the pain of the loss, and once we've been able to adjust to that new environment of that person not being in our lives anymore, that one of the things that we have to do is, he says, we have to find an enduring connection with the person that we've lost, while at the same time embarking on a new life. And I got to tell you, that was tough. That was tough. I know Elyse will talk about this, because she and I've talked about this before, that, one of the things that we look for when people are grieving to see how they're doing is, how are they doing about getting to a place of acceptance of that loss, and how there comes a point when that person comes to mind, that the memories are satisfying, and you smile when you think about that person, and then there's that embarking on a new life. All I knew at that particular point was that there was an emotional safety net that I had had for any number of years that was no longer there anymore. And so not only did I have to adjust to that environment, I had to figure out what that was going to look like for me moving forward. And luckily, as I made that process, I was able to reinvest. And the way that I did that for me was that I started doing a great deal of volunteer work. I took some of the things that Janie was really passionate about and started incorporating that into my way of living, whether it was going down to the Austin Street Shelter and feeding the hungry, or working at the North Texas Food Bank. And so there was this incorporation, this connection that I felt with her every time that I did that. Every time that I spent time with my daughter, I felt that, Jane, that connection was going on. And so that enabled me to embark on a new life. And so what I'll share with you is, in the midst of all of that, what I experience is that, I love it when people say, well, are you over it? And it's so funny because, if you haven't been through it, you really don't know, because you want to say, well, it's not a really question of being over it, is it? It's a way of integrating. And I think about Janie a lot sometimes. And yet at the same time, I feel that my life is full, and I have a sense of peace and contentment. But Worden says that those are the tasks. And one of the things that Worden really kind of points out, and Elyse has already said it, and that is, there's no timeline here. Everybody works through this and gets through this through their own process. This is not linear, and everybody has their own process that they go through. So that's the 4 tasks of mourning. Elyse, you want to talk about the 5 stages of grief?
I do. Thank you, Steve. Appreciate you sharing that with us. So I'm going to talk from a perspective of my job at American Airlines, because I'm really loving this ambiguous loss. And I think some of the situations I'm going to share for each stage of grief shows that it's not just a death, but it's many things, and how it can impact one that's not even really didn't lose anybody. And so some of the situations, so Elizabeth Kubler-Ross was she was a Swiss-born psychologist and came to America and worked here and developed the 5 stages of grief that has gone from being used as for grief and healing, and also change in work environments and how we move through many, many, many different situations. And I don't know if I mentioned this before, but I just want to make sure to mention, I'm pretty sure I did, but when we grieve, we don't just, it's not just about a death. It could be a pet, it could be a house, it could be moving, it could be our identity, our hopes and dreams. It's just a multitude of things, and it's what is important and close to us. So anyway, she developed these 5 stages of grief, and also wrote the amazing book on death and dying. And that came out in 1969, and it is still widely read and used in treating people. So in my career at American, so just so you know, I come from an alcoholic, abusive background. My dad was alcoholic. So I grew up in a really crazy, dysfunctional home. And I work at the airline, and it's a very exciting job, and I love excitement because of where I come from. And so in my job, so an employee assistance program helps employees that are having personal problems, and does a multitude of things. And one of the things that happened after, I had a good friend in Pam Am who ran their EAP, and she happened to be in Scotland when Lockerbie happened. And so all of us in the industry recognized that Pan Am had no program. They were not ready for, no program for a disaster like that, a major incident. And none of us did. We just never really thought that would ever happen, or how do you deal with it? So at American, we developed a program on how to deal with disasters. And so I was the on-site person for those disasters. So it was very exciting for me because I'm very good at cleaning up. I can go into something because of where I come from. It looks chaotic, looks crazy. I stand there, people see me calm, and I'm able to help them. And so I clean up messes really well. So it was very exciting for me. So I'm going to take each stage and talk about a small event. I could talk for hours about every event and everything that's happened to me, but I kind of went through ones that were my favorites that really struck home for me. And remember that I'll share this now. So what I learned after doing this, what I learned was that I had gone through ambiguous and complicated grief for all my years at American Airlines. And after I left American, I went for trauma therapy to help, because I did, and after I got better, through the work I did, I was able to recognize that I spent years after working, I worked 13 major events and a couple of tiny ones in between. And that's plane crashes. So other events with some hijacking, things like other things. But I walked around with my body really sore all the time, a little bit tired, just never really a huge amount of energy. I had a sense of sadness, not even sadness, hopelessness. And it was just deep inside. And I pretended really well. But after going through the trauma work, I realized what it was from. I had seen just really some incredible devastation, been part of it, helped people heal, and never really did much with it. We did little things, but I never did any deep trauma work around it. I never thought, well, I wasn't really involved. I didn't really lose anyone. So anyway, so her 5 stages are shock and denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. I'm sure many of you are familiar with these. And so first, our body and mind are just so unbelievably fascinating and just so miraculous that our body and mind work together to help us know when we're ready to deal with something or not. It will keep us in a state of shock and denial to help us function through. So shock is really what happens. It's the initial reaction to the situation, whatever happens. And often it's associated with paralysis in terms of, I can't think, I can't move, you're not sure what to do, become emotional numb, and a lot of refusing to accept the situation. And we go into fight and flight mode oftentimes with it. Also, and then there's denial, and denial is really trying to avoid the inevitability of accepting what's going on. So my first situation with this is, it was my first incident, and I was going to Chicago. About 235 people died, and they told me to go, and I remember walking through the airport to this day, and it was a long time ago, like a grown-up. I was 40 years old. I was ready to rock and roll. I was so excited. Anyway, when I got there, it was really the first few weeks. I was there for 6 weeks, but the first few weeks, I was just in this fight-flight mood. I was just in, I gotta keep moving, I gotta keep moving. There was no down movement. I talked with a lot of words like, this is fascinating. This is so interesting, really detached from everything. And I had to go to the morgue one day, and I was in Chicago. I had to go into the suburbs. I happened to go past the accident site, and it was so surreal because there was nothing there. The plane had crashed and everything was disintegrated. It was just surreal. I knew that all these people had died. I had to go to the morgue, and I won't go into everything. But driving back from the airport, I felt like a 2-year-old. That 40-year-old was with me the whole time, and driving back, I just felt like I don't know how I got back to the airport in my hotel. The next day, I couldn't even remember where I parked my car. I had to have someone help me. And what I realized was that I had been in shock and denial, just keeping myself going and going and going so that I could cope with the things I was seeing. And more happened with that. And next time I talk to you guys, I will share the end result of what happens when you don't take care of yourself. But I'm not going to do that here and now. So then the next one is anger. And anger is just a frustration and an outpouring of bottled up emotions. We either have harmful behaviors towards ourselves or others. We look for someone or something to blame. And it can be very, very dangerous for self and others. So I happened to work on 9/11. And I had just transferred to Dallas, and I'm from New York, and 9/11 happened. And I had my go bag. I went to the airport. You know, of course, you're in denial. You don't really, you think there's you think you're going to be killed, or there's a war, or when's the next plane coming? You can't even believe it. And so I was waiting for my assignment, and what happened, so it was really frustrating. I felt helpless. We didn't know if we were going to be able to do anything or go anywhere. And all I wanted to do was go to New York. I lived in right outside. I lived in Queens. I just wanted to go to New York. I wanted to make sure my family I was insane. I wanted to make sure my family was okay. I wanted to make sure my friends were okay. I wanted to make sure New York was okay. And my boss wouldn't listen to me. And he kept saying, you're going to Boston. You're going to Boston. And I was ridiculous. I was like, I'm not going to Boston. You have to send me to New York. Well, of course, nobody could go to New York. Nobody was allowed into New York. So, but I didn't realize it at the time. And I thought that it was his fault and he was punishing me. And and it was Boston's fault because they requested me. And it was ridiculous. I was a little ridiculous. But So I had a really big fight with him, and anyway, it worked out fine. There were 3 hour flights in the 3 flights in the air that night, and I was on one of them going to Boston, and so that takes me into, this is kind of a funny story, even though it's sad. That takes me into bargaining. So bargaining is trying to find a way out, trying to make sense of something, trying to make deals with doctors, lawyers, with my boss to get to New York. Trying to, if I did this, then this will happen. If I did that, then that would happen. And it was, so what happened was I'm on the plane flying to Boston, and there's just a certain group of people on the plane, ones that are trained. There's all management, and they're all trained to work on major incidences. The cockpit is open, everybody knows what's going on. And it just so happened that one of the vice presidents of American was on the plane going to Boston with us. So we're flying up, we're getting a lot of news. Like before we took off, we're getting news from the cockpit that there's war in Afghanistan, and we're getting all of these stories, and everybody's like, we're freaking out a little. We're on this plane, 3 planes just went down. And then we see F-16s coming on either side of us. So we're like, oh, everybody starts like making this up that they're here to save us. They're here to make sure nobody goes near us, and they flew in with us until we landed on the tarmac. And then 6 months later, so we were all bargaining. We all really made up this story about why the F-16s were there. 6 months later, I was at a meeting with this vice president, and he's kind of debriefing himself and telling the story about being on the plane with the F-16s. What he found out was after he got off the plane that the F-16s were there to shoot us down if something happened, or they found out something was happening on the plane. So here we are bargaining, kind of making believe and making sense that this is what's going to protect us and keep us all safe. And it wasn't real to begin with. But bargaining to me is one of the most intense forms of the grief process, because your head feels like you want to twist it and take it off and put it aside because it doesn't stop. Because we're human, we want to understand desperately what is happening, because we believe intellectually that if we understand what is happening and why it's happening, we can take a deep breath and move forward. And one of the things I know with grief and loss is that there's never an answer to a question. There's just always more questions. So, so the next is depression. And depression is a final realization of the inevitable, that this is what's happening. Buildings have gone down, people have died, the world is, who knows what's happening, but we have a spectrum of emotions. So it's not, depression doesn't go, and I know you all know this, but it doesn't go all the way to 100. Like you're so depressed you can't get out of bed. It goes, it's a spectrum, and it can be just you're very sad, or you can be really depressed, depending upon the day and depending upon the intensity of what's happening and what your loss is. There's a lot of ruminating. So at 9/11, whenever I worked an event, I had learned not to read the news, not to watch the news, not to read the news. The Department of Transportation always has a debriefing every day, so I would get what was happening from that debriefing. So I left Boston. I was flying home to DFW, and I took a paper. So it was the first paper I read, and I just couldn't believe all of the people that had died. I knew there was a massive amount of people, but I read the names of the people in the paper and their ages, and it just, I still can feel the shiver of it. And I started getting really, really upset. And you know, how people were dying. And so we landed in DFW, and that was, that was like, I went back, well, we landed in DFW, and there was nobody in the airport. It was like about 9 o'clock at night. There wasn't a soul there. All the cars had been moved. It was like I was maybe one of the last people on earth. And it brought me right back from the depression to shock and denial and bargaining, like, this can't be happening. So I kind of cycled, I went into this whole cyclical emotion of it. And what happened was that I worked, and I went into my fight flight mode. And but my friend called me up one morning, and we were talking, and she said, "You're not your usual bubbly self." She was worried about me, and she asked me to go talk to someone because she thought I was depressed, and I went, and that was something that I was really grateful for today, till today. So people are so important to have in our lives when we're going through some grief and denial, because they help us, and they see us, and they know us, and we need to listen to them. So then we come to acceptance, and acceptance is finding the way forward. It's finding a sense of peace of how the world works. It might not be, you know, we might not like it, but we're accepting it and taking it as this is what it is, and have to accept it and move forward. So 2 months after 9/11 happened, there was a really bad plane accident in Queens, and it was right where I lived. And the whole team, we all got up, we went there. Some of us were in shock. Some of us just went right back into shock. We went right back into that fight flight mode, and just functioned on pure adrenaline. And what happened during that was that I was exhausted. I was robotic. I was drained. I was spent. I never left an accident site of all of the sites I worked on. I refused to leave. If people died and people were still staying there, my team was there, I had to stay there. But I came to true acceptance on this because I couldn't help anyone. And I was always taught that I have to be a model of health. And I left. And that was probably one of the hardest things I ever did. I left about 2 weeks before they closed shop. I'm proud that I left. I took care of myself. Someone else came in to do a better job than I could do, because I recognized really what I was capable of and what I wasn't. The last one I want to talk about with you is as Kubler-Ross developed her 5 stages, she added integration. And there's a psychiatrist named James Montgomery. I don't know if many of you know him, but he taught me about relocation. So integration and relocation are really moving forward into the world, and that you've been able to accept, forgive, and move with, as Steve says, that a feeling of specialness and joy in your life for the person, though you miss them, or the thing. And so my integration for all of my happenings on accidents were, there was an accident at LaGuardia where I was based, and the plane just didn't make it. It came off, it fell in the water right off the runway. So some people lived and some people died. And months and months and months later, they were rebuilding the plane in my hangar. My office was over a hangar. And I went down to see it. And what I saw was there were some seats that were there, and there was some seats that weren't. And I don't know what happened, but it was such a spiritual experience for me that I realized that that was my culmination of all of this. And that was my end of so much of the grieving, was that life is just, I mean, I had a lot of spiritual experiences, but this is one that's so dear, that we only have today. Like, who is to say that the man in this seat did make it, and the one in this seat that was right next to him did. And I don't know, it was really a beautiful experience for me. And so integration comes in all different ways, but that experience helped me cope with many of the rest of the experiences that I went through. Anyway, so that's what I want to share about Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and the 5 stages of grief. And I'm internally grateful for experience and the knowledge that I've gained internally and passing them on to others through, I love this model. And I hope people can get that. I love it. So, one can feel that. Okay, I think I'm done. Thank you for listening.
So the next thing that we wanted to talk about is taking a look at where we are. I don't think that I need to say much about the impact of our current situation since about March, as far as how it has what it has effect on as far as who we are as people, and then also on that grieving process. You know, it's interesting that it almost as if all of the ways in which we managed life has pretty much kind of fallen by the wayside with COVID-19. And that it seems to me that it's altered how we view the world, how we view other people, and more importantly, kind of how we view ourselves. And one of the things that we know is that the world around us is in crisis. And really not just to those systems, but to our understanding of the world, you know, our healthcare system, careers, employment, all those kinds of things. But our whole understanding of the world and how we know it is in crisis. Robert Niemeyer talks and he says that the losses include our sense of predictability, that ability to count on things. It's our sense of what we're in control of and what we're not. But we, you know, one of the things that I constantly hear and on the news and in the paper is this feeling that I'm not in control. And this has some really strong internal issues for us as well. But it's not just about predictability. It's not just about control. It's about justice. And also that we've always had this belief that that we had the ability and the capacity to protect our children or to protect elderly loved ones that we have. And that's just simply not the case. So our sense of self and of who we are has been shaken. Our sense of what we are powered to do and what we are powerless to do. And I think that this can have a double-edged sword to it. There can be some really opportunities for transformation through all of this, you know, depending on how in which we choose to view this. You know, the one thing that you and I are in control of is, as we move through this, is our attitude and how we choose to think and see and respond. That's always within our control. But Nehemiah is correct. There's these losses that we experience are not just in all these governmental systems and healthcare and all those kinds of things, but it's about some basic human elements that we count on in order to stay grounded, not only in our world, but grounded within ourselves. And that's been shaken. And a great deal of that has been lost as well. So there's a lot to this piece.
Okay, so one of the things that I've noticed is the importance that we're in the middle of collective grief, that none of us are alone, and we really need to remember that we're all together. There's a quote from psychologist Sherry Korma, who states that it's important we remember collective grief. We're all losing something. Everyone has lost something, and we have to recognize that we're in a state of grief, and that many people are she goes on to say, many people are reckoning with individual losses, including illness, death due to COVID, loss of employment as a result of the economic upheaval. But even people who haven't lost anything due to COVID, or a job due to COVID, or loved ones, people are still affected by other losses. Somebody's sick in the hospital and they can't go visit them. So everybody around us, how we go food shopping is affected. If we're going to go to our friends, or the holidays coming up. So there is a communal grief as we watch. Our work, healthcare, education, and the economic system, all these systems are destabilizing. And we have to allow ourselves. One of the amazing things that I see with people is the strength to just keep coping. We just go into this system of flight and fight, and trying to make normalcy out of something that's just not normal, but we make it normal. It's just a beautiful thing to watch. However, we can't forget that we're all doing this, and we have to take care of ourselves. And I guess in talking about collective grief, talking about helping each other heal, and everybody is suffering. So to really be kind, I'm a real big one on being kind and gentle with self and others, because every single one of us are in some stage of grieving right now. So that's, Stephen, my presentation. I'm hoping that you got something from it. We do want to go over what's important to remember. And I'm going to turn that over to Steve, and I'll add some things if I need to.
Sure. So one of the things that we need to remember as we go forward is that grief is natural. And most people are resilient. And with time, with comfort, support, our ability to ask for help, using the coping skills that we have, that we can work through in a very healthy way the grieving process and the mourning that we experience. So one of the things too that we can do is to be able to acknowledge and kind of get that, shaking our sense of self-reality, that there's a part of that that's kind of gone, to wanting answers, to experience a sense of safety. The phrase that they use also too, that it's also really important to name and claim. So it's really important to be able to name what you're feeling, to name what you're going on. Why am I so tired? Okay, well, I'm tired because, I'm going through this process, and, and it's okay. This is part of it. To begin to allow ourselves to name the grief, allow ourselves to feel the grief, express it, not hide it or stuff it. One of the things I've always found interesting is the way in which we deal with grief these days. If you remember 100 years ago, there was actually a period of mourning. People wore black. There was this designation that these people were given a period of time socially to acknowledge, and it was a communal grief. I don't know about you, but I don't know about the place where you work, but I want you to think about how many days we're given off for a loss of a significant person in our family. 2 days, maybe 3. And then culturally, there's kind of this expectation that we're supposed to march back into work and everything's going to be fine. We've lost the ability within culture to mark the loss and give people space to grieve what they need to grieve. So it's really important that, because culture is not going to provide that for us, we have to learn to name that and to claim it for ourselves. And I can't say this enough, that given where we are right now, social connections are really necessary. In fact, I would share that they are now more necessary than ever. And that means getting on the phone. That means contacting people, doing Zoom, connecting with other people. Even if it's, going out for a walk and just, you may say nothing, but there's a connection that you feel. And it's not only with people, but it's with nature and it's with the environment. So there's this way that how important it is that we stay socially connected to each other. And then the other part, one thing that, I'm so good at, and that is that knowing when to ask for help. I don't know about you, but one of the delightful messages that I got growing up as a kid was, don't ask for help. Pull yourself up by your own bootstraps, and so it's important for us to give ourselves permission to ask for help. And it's also important to be able to ask for the encouragement of others. On a personal note, there was a lot of that in my personal experience that Elyse really kind of walked through with me. And she really went out of her way to stay connected to me. And there were just times when, as hard as it was, I would pick up the phone and just say, tell me I'm doing okay. And tell me that I can do this. Because this grieving process is a part of what it means to be human. It's kind of like how we started. It's a part of the human experience. Nobody escapes it. And it has the capacity to transform us if we will allow it. Elyse, any comments?
No, that was beautiful. I hope everybody took something from today, got something from today, and can see how much we both enjoy and respect the power of grief. And if anyone has questions, we'll take them now. I know Will had one question. I just saw it. Would you like to share it with the audience, Will, or would you want a private answer? Can you even hear me?
Oh, sure, I can hear you. I just work. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Mhm.
Yes. Okay. The question I had was for you and Steve, and Steve alluded a little bit to it, of what the grieving and the cultural grieving process was, and honoring of grief 100 years ago versus now. Do you think that the speed of technology is kind of driving an expectation that we should get over things at the speed of technology?
You want to answer that, Steve? I mean, it's up to you.
I think that, okay, so I'm probably going to show my age here, and you just need to know that I'm not a huge fan of social media. I'm not a huge fan of technology. I mean, I think it's like everything, it's a double-edged sword. I mean, I think that there are some powerful things that technology has enabled us to do, staying in contact with people over long distances. I can tell you that my experience was that, Facebook, when Janie was struggling, and it became a really important venue for me to be able to share with people, and so in some ways it's got some positive things. But, I just know that our culture has sped up so quickly via technology. I mean, when my computer takes 3 minutes to load up, I'm furious, and I'm getting ready to go buy a new one. I'm going to throw it away. And, so yeah, I think it does. I think sometimes the speed of which we have this, because there's this expectation, because we can have things instantaneously, and sure, that's going to spill over into the mindset culturally of, yeah, you need to be moving right along with this, and then what happens is that we get to this place to where, and if you're not, there's something wrong with you. And the solution is take something, So yeah, I definitely think that some of the technological advancements have, like I said, they're a double-edged sword. They do some powerful things, but then I think they've also conditioned the culture for us to move on. But I think to a certain extent that's been going on long before we moved into some of the kind of the fast-paced technologies that we're moving in today. We just don't know how. We just don't know how to,
Not only that, it's so unhealthy. Our bodies can't keep it up with it physiologically, psychologically. It's just dangerous, I think. So I agree, Will. I think, yes, I agree with what Steve said. So, Steve Kelly, somebody asked you for the name of the book, the 4 tasks. You know the name?
No, I'll have to look it up. I'll tell you what, how do we do that?
Do you remember the author,
Yeah,
Steve?
it's Robert Worden.
Wornten.
Yeah, William Worden, PhD, Worden, Williams, the first name, PhD, 4 Tasks of Mourning. It's probably the book.
Google it.
So, other
There's
questions?
also another question on the chat. My grief is a living one, the loss of a marriage, family, and ministry. When I finally divorced my abusive sex addict, mentally troubled husband, he is still alive, a danger, and blaming his problem on me. What am I grieving and how does it end?
Go ahead, Elyse.
That's a big question. I'm sorry you're in so much pain. And it is living. I'm glad that you're taking care of yourself. I hope that you're getting help from someone. I think I think that there's a lot of anger. I hear a lot of anger. I hear a lot of sadness. Whenever I see anger, I know there's a lot of sadness and pain and fear. I just hope that I hope that you're getting help for the grief and the loss, and that we can't tell you when it's going to end. It's what you can do to help it. It never will end, but it will go to a place where you're able to move on with your life and it doesn't control you and bind you. So I hope that if you don't have a therapist, that you contact us at D2 and we can help find you somebody that fits your needs. Is there anybody? The question was to everyone. So I'm going to say a prayer for you tonight. Tough stuff.
Very tough.
Yeah.
There is hope, though. I guess that's the one thing I want you to know. I've seen incredible hope with grief, but we have to. There's no way to get around the pain. We have to walk through it, and you won't die. It just will feel like you're going to die. but with people around you to love you, you can make it and walk through. Thank you for putting that question out there.
Any other
Elyse?
questions?
Yes, I do. Hi, I'm Peggy.
Hi, Peggy.
I have a question. You were talking about ambiguous loss. I've never heard that term. I've heard of it. Anticipatory grief, but I was just thinking, I have a friend that's in a memory care unit, a very dear friend. And so for me, it seems to me like that's anticipatory loss. I don't think she even knows me anymore, but I just crawl in bed with her and hold her and sing Jesus Loves Her to her. But then I also have this other one that I think is ambiguous, that my daughter's father died almost a year ago next week, my ex-husband. And the wife, current wife, has never had any service or anything. And these kids are just in limbo. When you were talking about this, I thought that's exactly where they are. It's unresolved grief. And so it really meant a lot that you shared that, because there's not a name to put on it. I know it's grief, but this just better helps explain the limbo that they're in and the frustration with it, and just trying to find an answer. Why didn't we do anything? And so that's hard, but I appreciate that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So if I can just say that you are also in limbo, even though he's your ex-husband, he still is your husband that you have two children with. So you all deserve some closure.
Yeah. Thank you.
I hope you find it. You're welcome.
We will.
Thank you. Thank you. I think it's beautiful with your friend that you get into bed and hold her. It's really lovely.
There's another question. How do you overcome the resistance to addressing grief?
Really good question. You know, I hate to say that you just wait till the pain, you can't bear the pain anymore. But, you know, for times for me, I had to become exhausted and numb. Today I'm not, and not be so, today I'm not fearful of grief. And I think that's a really important point of the resistance, because I know I'll be okay. I'm just going to be in pain, but the pain won't kill me. And I think before we feel that, or before we know that, before we know that and believe it, we have to go through it at least once. So I guess what I want to say to you is, if there's any time in your life when you looked back to conquering something that you never thought you could do, or finding faith in something, or having a real accomplishment that was so difficult and took courage, remember that and know that with that, you can do it again. And that can help lower your resistance. And then friends and a great therapist to help you know that you're going to be okay and walk with you through it.
So Steve and Elyse, I want to thank you very much for a great presentation. You guys did wonderfully on this, and we are deeply indebted to you for the information that you've provided to us. I want to thank everybody else for being a part of a great event tonight. And we welcome you back to come back next month when we have Rick Splitter, and his topic is overcoming the fear of deep intimacy with others, practical steps to open your heart. And Rick is a really good speaker, and he's a kind, gentle soul. And I know that anybody that was at this presentation would enjoy him at the next one. So from us at D2 Counseling, we appreciate your participation and welcome you back for the next one. Again, I posted in the comment section, if you'd like CEUs for this, check in with us at info@d2counseling.com and we can get CEUs lined out for you. And one of the things that we take great pride in at D2 Counseling is being resources for people. So if you have some needs, please check in with us. We can generally, we're well connected in the community. We can help you find the resources you need. So with that, I'll say good night. Dina, did you have anything else tonight?
Just that next month is our last one for the month. We won't, I mean, for the year, we won't be meeting in December. So hope to see you next month.
And then we'll pick back up again.
Back up in January. Stay
What is
safe,
that
everybody.
date? What is that date in November?
The 7th.
That November date is the 17th.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you all.
Thank you,
all.
Elyse. Thank
Great
you,
time,
Steve.
Everybody.